Hi, everyone. I'm Libby and I'm with John. And what you're about to see are 10 slides capturing how rapidly consumer decision making is evolving right now. We're tracking an accelerated trend where purchasing power is being weaponized to signal broader beliefs and affiliation. John, what's the context for what we're seeing?
Libby, we are looking at 3 years of economic cortisol. If you take a look at this chart, the background for these emerging patterns is a sustained economic anxiety, unlike anything we've tracked before. Our Harris poll data shows that economic stress has remained consistently high since 2022, even while other concerns fluctuate. So look at this chart. The green line representing economic anxiety has stayed near the top at nearly 90%, while other worries rise and fall. So economic stress has really become this sort of soundtrack to people's lives and their purchasing decisions. And brands that don't acknowledge this tension increasingly are going to be out of step with consumer mindsets. Libby, this anxiety appears to be manifesting in unexpected ways.
Yes, John. I think what's so interesting is that recession concerns are re-entering the chat. So while financial experts debate market predictions, everyday Americans are really bracing for impact. Our recent data shows that 76% of Americans are now actively concerned about the recession. They are struggling to afford basic living expenses, and 72% fear tariffs will push prices even higher. So what you're seeing here is that economic fragility is becoming the shared American experiences, where Americans are now back to stockpiling essentials, delaying major purchases, and making those hard choices about necessities, which isn't theoretical anxiety. It's really driving behavioral change that we're seeing in the market right now. How does this economic fear seem to be filtering in by various different groups? What does the data tell us?
Yeah, that's precisely what we're tracking, Libby. A complete reversal in perception has occurred. So last May, 70% of Republicans thought the economy was worsening versus 36% of Democrats. And those numbers have flipped today. 69% of Dems see a decline, while only 26% of Republicans do. Now, let's put that off to the side because some of economic opinion has become more partisan. But what really catches our attention is that despite these opposite views, 88% of Americans agree that actual everyday costs are the economic indicators that they really care about. And 76% don't feel improvement in their daily lives. So, Libby, the old axiom, it's the economy, stupid. Let's kind of forget that. It's actually really gas, groceries, and housing costs. Everyone understands this. This is like economic language that we all get, regardless of our political affiliation. And so we're watching this economic messaging enter different realities depending on who's hearing it. But the kitchen table economics cut through the noise and connects with the actual lived experience. So, Libby, how is this related to concerns around fundamental rights?
Yeah, John, what we're seeing emerge is that there's this triple threat happening of a situation where you have economic worry, recession fears, and now also human rights entering the chat, combining to create this perfect condition for consumer economic resistance. So our data shows that recently, in February 2025, 67% of LGBTQIA plus Americans believe their rights are being more compromised. 58% of women fear growing restrictions on their rights. And 57%, so all of these are over half of these groups of people of color feel their rights are under threat. So I think it's important to recognize it's not just economic hardship. It's about identity and fundamental freedoms feeling threatened simultaneously. And it's the combination of these three factors, the economic uncertainty, the recession fears, and the human rights that creates a stronger and potentially much more permanent move into the spending shifts we see today. As we're seeing this manifest, we also see, and what we dug into deeper, John, after we wrote that opt-out economy piece was the youth boycott nation. So really interesting. We see over a third of Americans are now participating in economic boycotts. And that jumps to over half of Gen Z at 53% and 46% of millennials. And what's notable is how Black and Hispanic Americans at 53% and 51% are leading those movements compared to white Americans at just 29%. And that's particularly in high profile places like Target. So the indicator here is that these aren't just casual shopping choices. Wallets are really becoming weaponized to man that corporate action. And this goes beyond the traditional voting with the dollars. It's consumers using their economic leverage to be heard in a system where those other feedback mechanisms have failed them. And so, but we want to dig deeper into that, John. Like, what is driving behind the decisions behind the boycotts?
Yeah, Libby, this is where the story gets absolutely fascinating. I think first, Libby, this is where the story gets fascinating because consumerism drives 70% of America's GDP. Now, we're calling this the loyalty divorce because consumers are strategically withdrawing their financial support from brands they once loved. And that's kind of creating a consumer grief where actually both shoppers and retailers feel this sudden break in relationships. So let's go into the numbers. Half of those boycotting at 53% explicitly say they are doing so to demonstrate their economic power and influence. Another 46% are protesting companies rolling back DEI initiatives, and that number jumps to 55% among Black Americans. Now look at this social post about Target. Recovering Target girly says, but it feels good to stand up for what's right, standing firm too. Across the spectrum, we're witnessing what looks like economic divorces rather than temporary shopping shifts.
Yeah, and what's particularly noteworthy about that, John, is 37% of Gen Z boycotters indicate plans to continue to boycott indefinitely or until a specific change occurs. Again, re-signaling that there's an idea of permanence there.
It's really taking consumer spending and thinking about it, especially for younger people in the context of agency. So Libby, how do these broken relationships go? Where do they go next?
Well, this is what we call, and we kind of joke, you and I, about this, but the idea that whiplash causes lasting injuries. So when you have nearly a third at 32% of Gen Z don't shop at their favorite store anymore because of the company's politics, which is significantly higher than the average at 24%, you can start to see that this is going to have some pretty serious long-term side effects for brands. When we dig deeper into why, we see three main drivers. The first one is that Gen Z say companies are more focused on profits than customers. The second one is that Gen Z say brands no longer reflect their core original values, that they've deviated from the values that they were promised. And the last one is that Gen Z cite ethical concerns or questionable practices that these companies are applying into the market. And so what we're watching is this value switching that costs brands dearly as Gen Z consumers and relationships with companies whose actions contradict their stated values. And John, we've been saying this for years, but this generation, Gen Z, looks for and keeps receipts. And so this isn't just about buying elsewhere. It represents what you're talking about, that true brand divorce. So my question to you, John, is how are we seeing this affect overall business perception?
Well, this is, again, concerning. And you think, Libby, of the work that we've been doing over the years in our Milken Institute Harris Poll listening project. We've notably for almost a decade seen strong favorability toward business. But what we're tracking now is a complete reversal from over a decade of business sort of being seen as the white knight in shining armor. Give you an example. Back in 2022, we found that 75% of Americans believed large companies were vital to America's future. And 60% saw companies as more reliable than the government in addressing social problems. Now, though, Americans equally blame corporations and politicians, both at 50% for higher prices. And also 44% report their opinion of American companies has recently worsened, citing price increases beyond inflation and unethical behavior. Most recently, among those who felt stuck or falling behind financially, they were more likely, actually, Libby, to blame American corporations than they were the government and its policies. So I think what we're looking here is monitoring sort of businesses' transition from hero to villain in the American narrative. The public goodwill companies once took for granted appears to be evaporating in these challenging times and potentially rewriting consumer engagement. So, Libby, how are you seeing consumers redirecting their spending?
Yeah. So, John, we've talked about this. We published a piece on this in February called the opt-out economy. And we love this data. It shows that Gen Z women are really at the forefront of the opt-out economy. Almost half, 46%, expressed no interest in supporting the economy this year, nearly 20 points higher than their male counterparts. And 43% of Gen Z women say they're finding ways to opt out of the economy. So they're finding ways not to participate and be part of it as a way to kind of step back. And then you also have 38% of all Gen Z reporting a reduce in their overall consumption. So again, this isn't just completely opting out, but it's also like, where are they redirecting their spending and their money? And so what we're monitoring is the demographic that historically built next generation retail empires, unicorns, is now potentially leading this kind of exodus from traditional consumption. And like what youth culture does is very important for overall consumption culture, right? So this shift has implications across every category. And it's not just about that withdrawal sense about it, but it's like, where are they going to then redirect? So that kind of gets us into our next slide, which is, what is everyone missing? Here are the 3 key insights to think about. The first one, today's boycotters are tomorrow's core consumers. So really, when we think about Gen Z, we have to remember, and it's got to be at the forefront of everyone's mind, that they are nearly half Black, Hispanic, AAPI, and or multicultural. And that's, when you get to Gen Alpha, that's over half. Also, lifetime brand preferences are forming at the critical age that Gen Z is at, that 18 to 25. And it's really interesting. Bank of America came out with a report recently that showcased that Gen Z will be the richest generation by 2035. So to miss this boat now is a big deal. Second, the money isn't vanishing. It's being redirected. Over half of both Gen Z and millennials have recently shifted their spending in the last few months just to align with their morals. And Gen Z plans to support more local businesses and seek value-aligned brands. And then number 3 is that we're starting to see, these are the beginnings of this. There's been a lot of movement, but see signals of permanence when you have over a quarter of Gen Z and millennial Americans say they're permanently changing their consumption habits, and that 37% of those Gen Z boycotters plan to do it indefinitely until they see change. So this isn't just a temporary shift. It's starting to mold into something a little bit different, maybe a fundamental reset in how consumers engage with brands. John, what should marketers or brands be thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, Libby, listening to that data, it's really sobering. And I think it's really important that businesses overall, brands, companies, if you're dealing with the consumer marketplace, you've got to be thinking about this redirection economy and really trying to understand what your next move is. And for us, it comes down to 3 things, right? We think that what businesses can do is to take 3 essential actions. Number 1, recognize, right? Recognize that consumers are grieving their broken relationships with brands. They might be boycotting, they might be culling back their consumption, but they also might not necessarily be feeling good about it internally. They feel hurt, misguided by companies that they once trusted. So the question to you is, are you pushing toward a breakup because of your shifting politics or your lack of listening? What are you doing to be that partner? In a recent Harris Poll survey, we found that 2/3 of Americans say that they buy more from brands that had empathy, and the exact same number feel that brands don't have it. Secondly, recalibrate. Consumers seek agency, and their spending power is weaponized as this cry for an understanding and for active listening. So is your organization aligned with this new reality? And lastly, respond. In the redirection economy, consumers are choosing not just products, but also the reality that they want to build with their dollars. The brands that understand this shift won't just survive, they're actually going to be redirecting spending that others are losing. So ultimately, Libby, this is a movement and an opportunity for those companies that really understand what's happening, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, in this redirection economy, your consumers are buying into their futures. And so if you want, you can contact our Harris Thought Leadership team and futures practice, either through myself or John, to understand how your specific industry or brand can navigate the redirection economy, because this isn't just a communication challenge. It's really a structural and a moment of time opportunity to build and rebuild those consumer relationships for the future.